The flight hadn't even taken off, and already, the most expensive seat on Apex Airlines was about to expose everything wrong with power, privilege, and race. She walked in, a black CEO, flawless blue suit, first-class ticket in hand. But before she could even sit down, a voice snapped through the cabin. "Move along. This isn't your spot." Picture the scene. The quiet hum of first class. The woman in the seat doesn't even grant her a glance. Just a bored, entitled flick of the wrist. And then it happens. A splash of dark red wine arcs through the air. You can almost see it in slow motion. The crimson liquid against the pristine, custom-tailored blue suit. It hits not like an accident, but like a slap in the face. A cold, wet stain of prejudice, blooming right over her heart. There was a collective, silent gasp from the other passengers. Frozen faces. The flight attendant, a woman with a name tag that read Rebecca, rushed over, her face a mask of practiced concern. But her eyes weren't on the woman in the stained suit. They were on the wine thrower. "Oh, Ms. Harrington, are you all right? Let me get you a towel." The woman in blue simply stood there, frozen for a moment, the dark liquid dripping onto the plush carpet. And in that moment, she did something no one expected. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She smiled. A slow, chilling smile that didn't reach her eyes. Before we reveal who they were really dealing with and how this story ends, do two quick things. If you believe that kind of public disrespect should never go unanswered, hit the like button. It tells the world these stories matter. And make sure you subscribe, because you will not want to miss the moment they find out the truth. Because by the time that plane landed, every name, every title, and every lie would be paid for in full. Have you ever been pushed so far past anger that all you have left is clarity? That woman was Taylor Campbell. At 39, she commanded boardrooms and navigated billion-dollar deals with the same quiet confidence she used to walk down the aisle of this Apex Airlines flight from New York to Los Angeles. Her low-cut hairstyle was neat, her stride was purposeful, and her suit was a silent testament to her success. But in this bubble of champagne and polite whispers, they didn't see a CEO. They saw a black woman, and they made an assumption. They assumed she was in the wrong place. Taylor calmly reached into her briefcase and presented her boarding pass to Rebecca. The ticket clearly read, T. Campbell, Seat 1A. Rebecca glanced at it, but her eyes glazed over, the information refusing to register. Her smile tightened, becoming a condescending grimace. "Ma'am," she began, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "I'm sure there's just been a little mix-up. These things happen." She never asked to see Olivia Harrington's ticket. She never questioned the woman who had just assaulted another passenger. The system was already working, protecting its own. The other passengers became a silent jury. Some stared openly, a mix of shock and morbid curiosity on their faces. Others quickly buried their faces in magazines or laptops, their silence a form of consent. The rows of luxury seats became invisible cages, where stares judged more than words. Taylor felt their eyes on her, felt the weight of their collective judgment. It was a familiar feeling, that sting of being treated like an imposter in a space you earned. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about her right to exist in this space without challenge. "Why don't we find you another seat?" Rebecca offered, her voice low, as if sharing a secret. For everyone's comfort. The implication was clear. Taylor's presence was the source of discomfort. Her existence was the disruption. Taylor's voice, when she finally spoke, was steady. It was the same voice she used to dismantle hostile takeover attempts. "My seat is 1A. The seat currently occupied by Ms. Harrington." Rebecca's patience snapped. The professional veneer cracked, revealing the ugly prejudice underneath. "Ma'am, to avoid a scene, perhaps we can find you a spot further back." She gestured vaguely toward the curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane. They were trying to move her, to hide her, to erase her. But Rebecca had no idea who she was talking to. She had no idea that this quiet, dignified woman held the fate of Apex Airlines in the palm of her hand. With a final, dismissive sigh, Rebecca reached for her intercom button. "This is a matter of operational necessity," she said, her voice now firm and official. "I'm going to have to ask you to cooperate." But Taylor didn't move. She simply held Rebecca's gaze, her calm expression unwavering. She then asked a simple question that hung in the air like a guillotine. "Is your supervisor on board today, Rebecca?" Taylor's question, calm and direct, sliced through the tension. Rebecca's practiced smile faltered. For a moment, she was just a deer in the headlights. A passenger demanding procedure was not part of her script. She fumbled with the intercom on her lapel, her voice a strained whisper. "We have a passenger issue in first class." A moment later, a man in a slightly different uniform, her supervisor, arrived. He used a kind of weary authority, a man whose job was to make problems disappear with minimal paperwork. He didn't look at Taylor. He looked at Olivia Harrington. "Everything all right, Ms. Harrington?" he asked, his tone familiar, friendly. The system was recognizing one of its own. Olivia simply waved a dismissive hand towards Taylor. Only then did the supervisor turn his gaze on her, his eyes cold and assessing. He didn't ask for her side of the story. He didn't ask to see her ticket. He had already made his decision based on what he saw. Taylor began to explain, holding up her boarding pass, but he cut her off with a placating hand gesture. "Ma'am," he said, the word a subtle insult, "we don't want to disrupt our premium guests." The message was brutally clear. Taylor, despite her ticket, was not one of them. She was the disruption. Just then, a calm, disembodied voice crackled over the cabin speakers. It was the pilot. "Cabin crew, please resolve the seating issue quietly and prepare for departure." That was it. The final stamp of institutional approval. The pilot didn't care about right or wrong. He cared about an on-time departure. With the captain's blessing, the supervisor's posture hardened. His professional courtesy evaporated, replaced by the grim finality of corporate power. He was no longer managing a complaint. He was handling a security issue. And Taylor was the issue. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "Ma'am, your cooperation is no longer a request. It is an operational necessity. Now, are you going to take the seat we offer you, or will we have to remove you from this aircraft?" The supervisor's threat was a dead end, a wall of corporate authority designed to crush any resistance. Taylor Campbell stood her ground, her silence more powerful than any shout. The other passengers stared, trapped in that awkward space between wanting to intervene and fearing the consequences. But across the aisle, someone else was watching. His name was Malik, a 20-year-old film student who saw the world through a lens. He didn't just see a conflict, he saw a scene. He saw a story of injustice playing out in real time, and his instincts took over. Slowly, discreetly, he raised his phone, angling it just right. The screen was off, but with a subtle tap of his thumb, a tiny red light blinked on. He was recording. The evidence now existed. Emboldened by her supervisor and the pilot's command, Rebecca stepped forward, her voice a syrupy threat. "Let's move you to economy before things get embarrassing," she said, loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. It was the final nail in the coffin of her dignity, a public shaming meant to force her into submission. Malik's camera zoomed in slightly, capturing the look on Taylor's face. It wasn't shame. It wasn't fear. It was a cold, cutting focus. Her voice, perfectly steady, pierced the silence. Embarrassing for who? The question hung in the air, a direct challenge to Rebecca's authority. The flight attendant's face flushed. She had no answer. She had expected tears or a retreat, not a question that turned the humiliation back on her. Beside Malik, an older woman leaned over to her husband and whispered, "That's not right. They can't do that." The whisper was quiet, but in the suffocating silence, it felt like a gunshot, a crack in the wall of bystander apathy. Taylor was no longer completely alone. The system was being watched, and for the first time, it seemed to be malfunctioning under the pressure. The supervisor, realizing he had lost control of the situation, reached for his radio with a new sense of urgency. His voice was clipped, betraying a flicker of panic. "I need Captain Reeves in the first-class cabin." Now, the man who arrived was the picture of command. Captain Reeves, the flight's purser, had the kind of silver-haired, steely-eyed presence that ended arguments before they began. He listened to Rebecca and her supervisor with a patient nod, his face unreadable. He never once glanced at Taylor during their hushed, one-sided briefing. The system was reinforcing itself, passing the flawed story up the chain of command. When he finally approached Taylor, the air in the cabin grew thick and heavy. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but it was the kind of calm that comes with absolute power. It was the voice of the institution itself. "Ma'am," he began, his tone patronizing, "I understand there's been some confusion with your seat." He glanced at her wine-stained jacket with a look of mild distaste. "Let's not make this bigger than it is." And then he delivered the line that sucked the air out of the cabin, the phrase designed to silence and shame. "This isn't about race." The words were a brutal dismissal of her entire reality. He was telling her that what she was experiencing wasn't real, that she was the one being unreasonable. Olivia Harrington, watching from seat 1A, couldn't hide her smirk as she took a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne. She was enjoying the show. The other passengers seemed to shrink in their seats, their silence now a heavy blanket of complicity. Taylor was utterly alone, cornered by the highest authority on the plane. Reeves leaned in slightly, his voice dropping. "We have a schedule to keep. Now, for the last time, you can either accept another seat, or we can have you escorted off the plane when we return to the gate. It's your choice." The threat was no longer subtle. It was a final, crushing ultimatum. The cabin was a tomb, everyone waiting for her inevitable surrender. But Taylor didn't break. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she held his gaze and asked a simple, devastating question that no one was prepared for. "Are you and your crew familiar with Federal Aviation Code 14 CFR, Part 13? Captain Reeves stared at Taylor, his professional calm finally cracking. A flicker of confusion, then annoyance, crossed his face. He was prepared for tears, for arguments, for a defiant scene. He was not prepared for a question that sounded like it belonged in a courtroom. It was a language he wasn't fluent in. His authority came from a corporate manual, not the code of federal regulations. He looked to Rebecca, who just blinked back, equally lost. The power dynamic in the cabin had just tilted on the head of a pin. The entire crew had been operating on the assumption that they held all the cards. But Taylor Campbell had just revealed that she was playing an entirely different game. Taking advantage of their stunned silence, Taylor's voice cut through the cabin, calm and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. She didn't raise it, but every passenger leaned in to hear. "You threatened to remove me from this flight for non-compliance," she stated, making eye contact with Reeves. "But you failed to perform your primary duty in a seating dispute, to verify both passengers' tickets. Your own procedures were violated." She paused, letting the weight of his failures settle in the air. "Now, you're attempting to use your authority to intimidate a ticketed passenger who has done nothing wrong. I believe that falls under a misapplication of your duties as outlined in 14 CFR Section 91.11, which prohibits interference with a crew member who is lawfully performing their duties." The key word is lawfully. For the first time, raw, unfiltered doubt appeared on Captain Reeves' face. He and his crew were experts in de-escalation and customer management, but they were utterly unprepared for a passenger who knew the rules better than they did. Taylor hadn't just stood up for herself. She had raised the standard, weaponizing the very regulations they were supposed to uphold. Her composure was no longer passive. It was an offensive strategy. Viewers in that moment didn't just see a woman being harassed. They saw a leader taking command. Across the aisle, Malik was capturing it all, his hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline. He knew this was more than just a viral moment. This was a masterclass in dignity and power. While the crew stood frozen, unsure of their next move, Malik connected his phone to the plane's sluggish Wi-Fi. With a few frantic taps, he wrote a simple caption: "Apex Airlines crew threatens black woman after another passenger steals her first-class seat." He added the hashtags, #FlyingWhileBlack and #Apex Airlines. And then, at 35,000 feet, he pressed the upload button. The progress bar crawled for a moment, then flashed complete. The video, the evidence the spark was out. It was rocketing across the globe at the speed of light, and nobody in that silent, tension-filled cabin had any idea. A video uploaded from 35,000 feet is a whisper in a hurricane. But sometimes a whisper is all it takes. Malik's video, grainy and shaky, landed on the internet with no fanfare. For a few minutes, it was just one of millions of clips lost in the digital noise. Then it got its first share, then a dozen more. An activist with 50,000 followers retweeted it with the caption, "This is what hashtag flying while black looks like on at Apex Airlines. Do better." That was the spark. The video began to move, its view count ticking up from hundreds to thousands, then tens of thousands in the time it took to serve a drink. On the plane, a tense, unspoken truce had settled over the first-class cabin. Captain Reeves, thoroughly rattled by Taylor's legal knowledge, had retreated. They didn't move Olivia, but they also stopped threatening Taylor, leaving her to stand in the aisle in a humiliating limbo. Taylor eventually took an empty seat a few rows back, not in defeat, but in strategic patience. She remained silent, her composure a shield. She didn't know it, but her silence was becoming her greatest weapon, because online, a massive army was gathering to speak for her. Digital sleuths got to work. They screenshotted the video, enhancing the blurry name tags. Soon, the names Rebecca and Captain Reeves were circulating. Someone found the flight number from a brief shot of another passenger's ticket. Hashtag Apex Airlines Flight 212 began trending. The hashtags evolved. Hashtag Seat 1, hashtag Justice for Jane Doe, hashtag Fire Rebecca. The story was no longer just about an anonymous woman. It had characters, a setting, and villains. Major news journalists, influencers, and civil rights leaders were now demanding a public statement from Apex Airlines. The story had escaped the confines of the airplane and was now a full-blown international incident. By the time the plane began its final descent into Los Angeles, the video had crossed 1 million views. Apex Airlines' social media team was in a state of panic, their corporate Twitter feed a dumpster fire of angry comments and threats of boycotts. They drafted a weak, generic response about looking into the incident, but it was like trying to put out a forest fire with a water pistol. The world wasn't just watching, it was passing judgment. The plane finally touched down. The seatbelt sign pinged off. As passengers began to turn on their phones, a wave of beeps and vibrations filled the cabin. A few people gasped as notifications flooded their screens, their faces illuminated by the video they had just witnessed in person. In a glass-wall crisis room back in New York, the senior VP of communications for Apex was on the phone with the LAX ground manager. "Is she talking? Has she made any demands?" the VP asked frantically. "No," the manager replied, his voice strained. "She hasn't said a word. She just walked straight past our customer service agents. There's a black car waiting for her at the curb. A taxi? An Uber?" There was a chilling pause on the other end of the line. "No, it's a private executive town car. And according to the driver, he's here for a Ms. Taylor Campbell from Novatech Capital." Inside the glass-walled headquarters of Apex Airlines, the atmosphere was not one of concern, but of pure, unadulterated chaos. A dozen executives in tailored suits paced the floor of an emergency war room, their faces grim. On a massive screen at the front of the room, two things were displayed side by side. The viral video of Taylor Campbell being humiliated, playing on a sickening loop, and a live feed of Apex's stock price, which was plummeting in a waterfall of red. Every few minutes, a junior analyst would call out a new, horrifying number. "We're down 9% since the market opened." The phrase "boycott Apex" is the #1 trend on Twitter. The room buzzed with the frantic, high-pitched energy of a problem spiraling out of control. The name dropped by the LAX manager echoed from a speakerphone in the center of the table. Novatech Capital. "Give me everything we have on Novatech," the CEO barked. "Are they a corporate account? How many flights do they book a year? Find out what their value is to us, so we can make this right." The PR chief, a man named Kenji, was already typing furiously, his fingers flying across his keyboard. The other executives were shouting suggestions, arguing about strategy. Should they fire the crew immediately? Should they issue a full apology? Should they offer the woman free flights for life? Their panic was focused entirely on fixing the public relations nightmare. They still thought this was about a viral video. Then, Kenji stopped typing. In the midst of the chaos, his stillness was jarring. He slowly raised his head from his monitor, and his face was completely white, as if he'd just seen a ghost. The shouting in the room died down as everyone turned to look at him. "Kenji? What is it?" the CEO demanded. Kenji swallowed, his voice barely a whisper. "The woman in the video, she's not just from Novatech Capital." He took a shaky breath. "She's Taylor Campbell. She's the founder and CEO." A deep, profound silence fell over the room. The frantic energy vanished, replaced by a cold, heavy dread. The stock ticker and a looping video were forgotten. There was only that name. The chief operating officer, a man who prided himself on his unflappable demeanor, slowly sank into his chair, running a hand over his face. He looked at the CEO, his eyes wide with dawning horror. "Novatech Capital," he muttered, the pieces clicking into place with an audible, terrifying snap. "That's not just an investor. That's the funding source for the Trans-Pacific expansion." He looked around at the stunned faces in the room and delivered the final, devastating blow. "That's the $5 billion deal. We just humiliated the woman who is personally signing the contract next week." The panic in the room instantly curdled into something far worse: abject terror. This was no longer a PR crisis they could manage with a press release and a settlement. This was a corporate extinction event. Their entire future, every new plane, every new route, every projected quarterly earning was tied to the goodwill of the very woman they had just publicly shamed and dismissed. Their systemic prejudice, their casual cruelty, their obsession with a certain kind of premium passenger had led them to assault their own lifeline. The CEO, his face ashen, finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "Get her on the phone. Get her on the phone right now." His assistant fumbled with her desk phone, her hands trembling. After a moment, she looked up, her expression terrified. "She's not answering any of our calls, sir. They're all going straight to her legal counsel." "Then find out where she is," the CEO roared, slamming his fist on the mahogany table. Just then, Kenji's laptop pinged with a news alert from a major press wire. He read it, and all the color drained from his face. He looked up at the CEO. "Sir, we know what she's doing. Her legal team has just announced a public statement." "Where?" the CEO demanded. Kenji swallowed. "Here, tomorrow morning, at 9. The next morning, the lobby of Apex Airlines Los Angeles headquarters felt like a funeral home. A podium had been hastily erected, surrounded by a chaotic swarm of journalists and flashing cameras. The CEO and the COO stood to the side, their faces pale and drawn from a sleepless night of terror. They looked like men waiting for a verdict to be read. When the glass doors slid open, a hush fell over the room. Taylor Campbell walked in. She was not the victim in the wine-stained suit from the video. This woman was wearing a razor-sharp, ivory-white pantsuit, an armor of her own making. Flanked by two lawyers, she moved with an unshakable calm, ignoring the shouted questions from the press and the desperate, pleading eyes of the Apex executives. She didn't wait to be introduced. She walked directly to the podium, claimed the space as her own, and the room fell completely silent. She looked out at the sea of cameras, her gaze steady. "Good morning," she began, her voice crisp and clear. "I know why you're all here. You've seen the video." She let that hang in the air for a moment. "But what I need you all to understand is that the video is not the real story. It is a symptom of a much deeper problem." She paused and then delivered the words that would define the entire conflict. "You didn't know who I was when you disrespected me. And that is the problem." She scanned the faces in the crowd, letting her words sink in. "Because my humanity, my right to be treated with dignity, should not be dependent on my job title or the balance in my bank account." The crew of that flight made a judgment based on a profile. They saw a black woman where they expected to see someone else, and they acted on that prejudice. The issue isn't that they humiliated a CEO. It's that they believed it was acceptable to humiliate any passenger who looked like me. In a small, windowless crew lounge near the airport, Rebecca and Captain Reeves were huddled around a television, watching their careers evaporate in real time. Miles away, in her lavish Hollywood Hills home, Olivia Harrington stared at the same broadcast on her giant flat-screen TV. The smug smirk finally wiped from her face as she realized the woman she'd sneered at was about to dismantle an entire corporation. They were watching the ghost they thought they had dismissed come back to haunt them, more powerful than they could have ever imagined. Back at the press conference, Taylor's tone shifted from moral clarity to cold, hard business. Because of the culture that this incident has exposed, she said calmly, I can no longer have confidence in the leadership or the operational integrity of Apex Airlines. The Apex CEO visibly flinched. As most of you don't know, my company, Novatech Capital, is the primary financial partner in Apex's planned $5 billion trans-Pacific expansion. A wave of gasps and frantic typing swept through the reporters. As of 8 a.m. this morning, Taylor continued, I have instructed my board to place an immediate and indefinite freeze on that funding. Your expansion is on hold. The room erupted. In the crew lounge, Rebecca let out a small, strangled sob. The executives by the wall looked like they might collapse. A reporter shouted over the noise, Ms. Campbell, are you trying to bankrupt the airline? Taylor held up a hand for silence. Her expression was unreadable, her voice dangerously quiet. I'm not interested in one airline, she said, looking directly into the main camera as if speaking to the entire industry. I'm interested in changing the way you do business. What happened on that plane was not an isolated incident. And I promise you, the consequences will not be isolated either. Taylor Campbell's final words at the press conference were not just a statement. They were a declaration of war on an entire industry's status quo. And the shockwaves were immediate. Within hours, her speech was the lead story on every major news network. Cable news channels ran split screens. On one side, Taylor's powerful, composed face at the podium. On the other, the grainy, humiliating footage from Malik's phone, playing on a continuous loop. The incident was no longer just a viral moment. It had become a national case study in modern corporate racism. The narrative had shifted from what a terrible employee to what a broken system. The public outcry was so immense and so sustained that it became impossible for Washington to ignore. The Secretary of Transportation issued a sharp public rebuke, and by the end of the week, the Department of Transportation had formally announced a full-scale review of Apex Airlines policies regarding passenger discrimination and employee training. The federal government was now knocking on their door, demanding years of complaint records, training manuals, and hiring statistics. This wasn't just bad press. This was a legal and regulatory siege. The machine of bureaucracy, so often a tool to protect corporations, was now turning its gears against one of its own. The firestorm also spread to Apex's competitors. In boardrooms across the country, the CEOs of other major airlines were holding their own emergency meetings. Their social media teams were put on high alert, their legal departments ordered to conduct immediate reviews of their own anti-discrimination protocols. Every airline knew that they were just one viral video away from becoming the next Apex. Taylor's humiliation had become a terrifying cautionary tale for the entire industry. They weren't just scrambling to avoid bad press. They were scrambling to prove they weren't suffering from the same cultural rot that had infected Apex. Meanwhile, Apex Airlines was collapsing from the inside. Furious shareholders, watching their investments evaporate, were calling for the immediate resignation of the CEO and the entire board. Major corporate clients began to quietly cancel their bulk fare contracts, citing ethics clauses. The company was bleeding money, trust, and talent. They had become radioactive. Taylor Campbell herself had gone silent since the press conference. She had lit the fuse, and now she was letting the system reckon with the explosion she had caused. She didn't need to say another word. The government, the media, and the stock market were doing the work for her. The Apex CEO, a man named Arthur Vance, sat alone in the deep twilight of his corner office. His empire was burning, and he knew there was only one person who held the water. This next act wasn't in any crisis playbook. It was an act of unconditional surrender. His hands, usually so steady signing off on billion-dollar acquisitions, trembled as he dialed the private number. It rang once, then twice. He almost lost his nerve and hung up, but on the third ring, the line connected. There was no greeting, just a cold, knowing silence on the other end. She knew who was calling. He cleared his throat, trying to summon a shred of his former authority. "Ms. Campbell? This is Arthur Vance." The voice that finally came back was calm, controlled, and utterly devastating in its simplicity. "I know who this is." That was all it took. The last wall of his composure crumbled to dust. The CEO was gone, leaving only a desperate man pleading into the phone. "Please," he begged, his voice cracking under the weight of his ruin. "We're done. Just tell us what you want." Arthur Vance's desperate plea hung in the silence of the phone line for a long, calculated moment. Taylor Campbell let him wait, letting the full weight of his company's ruin settle upon him. When she finally spoke, her voice was devoid of emotion, a flat, powerful instrument of command. "My office will be in touch to schedule a meeting at our headquarters," she said. "Come prepared to listen." Then she hung up. The next day, Vance and his COO walked into a boardroom at Novatech Capital. It was a stark, minimalist space, all glass and steel, overlooking the city from the 50th floor. It was a room built for power, and today, all of it belonged to Taylor. She was already there, standing at the head of a long table, flanked by a single lawyer. The Apex executives took their seats, looking small and out of place. They had come with a thick binder filled with settlement offers and damage control strategies. They still thought this was a problem that money could solve. Vance cleared his throat and began, his voice strained with false confidence. "Ms. Campbell, on behalf of Apex Airlines, I want to offer our most profound and sincere apology. What happened to you was inexcusable." He pushed a binder across the table. "We are prepared to offer a substantial 7-figure donation to a charity of your choice, full compensation for the damages, and, of course, a significant personal settlement for your distress. We want to make this right." Taylor didn't even glance at the binder. She let his words hang in the air for a moment before dismissing them with a slight shake of her head. "Arthur, you still don't get it," she said, her tone less angry than disappointed. "You think this is about me. You think this is about a stained suit and hurt feelings. You can't write a check to fix a broken culture." The hope drained from Vance's face. He was completely off script, his financial weapons rendered useless. The boardroom, which he had entered as a negotiator, had just become a classroom. "I'm not here for your money," Taylor continued, her voice gaining strength. "I'm here to unfreeze my company's $5 billion investment. And for that to happen, things are going to change. Here are my terms." She began to pace slowly, her presence dominating the room. "First, you will commission a top-to-bottom, fully independent diversity and inclusion audit. I want to see the unvarnished truth of your hiring, promotion, and disciplinary practices. You cannot fix a disease you refuse to diagnose." She stopped and looked them in the eye. "Second, you will completely overhaul your employee training programs. No more box-checking online modules. I want intensive, scenario-based training designed by leading sociologists, with real accountability for those who fail to meet the standard." She took another step. "And third, you will present me with a clear, actionable, 5-year plan to identify, mentor, and promote Black and other minority employees into senior leadership positions. Because the only way to ensure lasting change is to change the faces in the cockpit and in the boardroom." The executives were stunned into silence. This was so much bigger, so much harder than just writing a check. This was a demand to rebuild their company's very soul. Vance, looking utterly defeated, finally found his voice. "And if we do all of this, the deal is back on." Taylor walked back to the head of the table. "You don't need to fear me, Arthur," she said, her voice softening slightly. "You need to change." She picked up her briefcase and turned to leave the room. Vance thought for a fleeting second that it was over. But then Taylor paused at the door. "One last thing," she said, her back still turned to them. Her voice had lost its warmth, replaced now by a blade of ice. "Those are my terms for the corporation. We haven't yet discussed accountability for the individuals. Flight 212. Rebecca, Captain Reeves, and Olivia Harrington. I expect a detailed report of the disciplinary actions taken against all three on my desk by Friday. She finally turned her head slightly, her gaze locking onto Vance. Don't disappoint me. On Friday morning, exactly as demanded, a secured PDF landed in Taylor Campbell's inbox. The sender was Arthur Vance. The subject line contained a single word: accountability. The world had cheered Taylor's takedown of the corporate giant, but for justice to be real, it had to be personal. This report was the final invoice for the humiliation served on Flight 212. Taylor opened the file, her face illuminated by the screen's glow. The justice inside was not swift and angry, but cold, methodical, and delivered in the precise language of corporate power. First, the passenger, Olivia Harrington. The courier-delivered envelope was thick and embossed with the Apex logo. She likely opened it expecting a groveling apology, perhaps a book of first-class travel vouchers for her trouble. But the language inside was not apologetic. It was legal and final. Citing multiple violations of the airline's contract of carriage, the letter informed her that her A-list platinum executive status was permanently revoked. Her nearly 2 million accumulated frequent flyer miles were forfeited, effective immediately, and she was now on the company's permanent no-fly list. The status she had wielded like a weapon had been surgically removed. The airline she felt she owned had just disowned her completely. For her, the justice was corrective. She was no longer a premium guest, but a liability. Next, the flight attendant, Rebecca. She was called into a meeting not in a familiar office, but in the sterile HR wing on the 12th floor. The senior vice president of human resources didn't offer her coffee or condolences. He simply slid a single sheet of paper across a polished table. "Rebecca," he said, his voice flat, "your actions were inconsistent with the values and operational security of this airline. They have created a liability we can no longer tolerate." There was no discussion, no review. She was informed that her employment was terminated. Her 15 years of service were erased by one afternoon of prejudice. The system she had so confidently used to dismiss Taylor was now dismissing her with the same impersonal, brutal efficiency. It was, the report noted, an operational necessity to restore public faith. Finally, Captain Reeves, the purser. For him, the process was coated in a thin veneer of professional courtesy that only made it more insulting. They called it a transition meeting. In a quiet room, they laid out two paths: a brutal, public termination following a full investigation with the Department of Transportation, or a quiet, immediate resignation. It was the illusion of choice. He could either be thrown from the building or be given a parachute to soften the landing. But either way, his career at Apex was over. The next morning, Apex Airlines accepted his letter of resignation, citing personal reasons. His legacy, 30 years of service, was now a permanent stain on his record, forever defined by the incident he had tried to make smaller. Later that day, Apex Airlines issued a full, unconditional public apology to Taylor Campbell and to its customers. The statement detailed the new diversity audits and training reforms, using the exact language Taylor had dictated. The internet erupted in celebration. Hashtags like #JusticeForSeat1 trended for hours. The audience, the digital jury, had its verdict. But in her office, high above the city, Taylor Campbell felt no joy as she closed the file. There was no triumphant smile. There was only a quiet, heavy solemnity. This wasn't a game she had won. It was a battle she should never have had to fight. She felt the weight of the lives she had just irrevocably altered. A necessary correction, but a painful one. As she stared out at the city lights, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Ms. Campbell, this is Malik, the guy from the plane. I just wanted to say thank you." The young man's voice was filled with an awe that cut through her solemn mood. "What you did, it changed how I see everything." And for the first time that day, a small, genuine smile touched Taylor's lips. The heavy feeling in her chest was replaced by something new. It was the feeling of a different kind of story just beginning. The fire of a viral story burns hot and fast, and most are forgotten within a week. But the story of Taylor Campbell and Apex Airlines was different. After the immediate shock and the satisfying delivery of justice, the flames didn't die out. They settled into a slow, steady burn that began to warm the entire culture. Weeks turned into a month, and the incident evolved from a news headline into a powerful, enduring parable for the modern age. It became known as the Seat 1A incident, and it was now being discussed in the very spaces that define our society. In university lecture halls, business ethics professors were adding the Apex case study to their syllabi, using it to teach a new generation of leaders about the catastrophic cost of implicit bias and the real-world value of a dignified response. In corporate boardrooms, CEOs of rival companies referenced the scandal in hushed, fearful tones. "We cannot afford an Apex situation," became the new mantra, sparking internal reviews of customer service policies and a sudden, urgent interest in diversity consultants. Even in churches and community centers, pastors and leaders spoke of Taylor Campbell, using her story to illustrate the quiet strength it takes to stand firm in your own God-given dignity when the world tries to deny it. But the most profound impact was felt by the people who saw themselves in Taylor's shoes. Across the country, young Black professionals shared the video in their private group chats and discussed it at networking events. For them, it was more than just a satisfying story of revenge. It was a blueprint. Taylor's calm, intellectual takedown of the airline's authority became an inspiration. It was proof that you didn't have to meet aggression with aggression. It was evidence that dignity could be louder and more effective than rage. Her composure was no longer seen as passive, but as a sophisticated weapon of power. She had given them a new model for navigating the elite, often hostile spaces they worked so hard to enter. The hashtag #FlyingWhileBlack, which had been a cry of pain for years, was now joined by a new, more hopeful one. #RespectInTheSky. It became a global campaign, a platform where people not only shared their stories of discrimination, but also celebrated airlines that were getting it right and demanded the changes Taylor had forced upon Apex. What started with one woman being denied her seat had become a full-fledged movement, a public demand for decency at 35,000 feet. Rival airlines, seeing the writing on the wall, began to quietly adopt her reform model, hoping to avoid a similar fate. Taylor watched all of this mostly from a distance, her name now a symbol for something far bigger than herself. Her office was flooded with awards, interview requests, and speaking invitations. But one rainy Tuesday afternoon, a single piece of mail arrived that cut through all the public noise. It wasn't a business proposal or a fan letter. It was a simple, plain envelope addressed to her in a shaky, unfamiliar cursive. It felt heavier than all the others. Inside was a single, folded sheet of notebook paper. The letter began with 3 words that stopped her cold. "Dear Ms. Campbell." Taylor held the letter in her hands, the shaky cursive on the simple envelope feeling more significant than any embossed corporate logo. Months had passed since the incident, and the world had moved on, but this letter was a direct echo from that day on the plane. She unfolded the single sheet of notebook paper, her eyes scanning past the opening line, "Dear Ms. Campbell," and into the heart of the message. It was from Rebecca, the flight attendant, and its words were not an excuse, but a confession. "I don't expect you to read this, and I don't deserve your forgiveness," it began. "I am writing this because I need to tell you that you were right. Losing my job, my pension, it felt like the end of the world. But the truth is, it forced me to see a world I had refused to look at for 50 years. In my mind, I had a profile of what a first-class passenger looked like. It was a bias I didn't even know I had until it was reflected back at me on every news channel in the country. My actions weren't just a mistake in customer service. They came from an ugly place inside me. I am not writing to ask for anything. I am writing to say that I am sorry for the person I was on that day, and that because of you, I'm trying to become someone better." Taylor finished the letter and leaned back at her chair, the simple paper feeling incredibly heavy in her hands. A part of her the part that still remembered the sting of public humiliation, wanted to crumple it up and throw it away. Justice had been done. The account was settled. Rebecca had made her bed, and now she was lying in it. That was the easy, clean, satisfying end to the story. But Taylor had never been one for easy things. She saw something else in Rebecca's words. She didn't see an excuse. She saw a confession. She didn't see an enemy begging for mercy. She saw a human being admitting to a profound failure. What would you do in her shoes? The person who publicly shamed you is now broken, apologetic, and asking for nothing but to be heard. Do you grant them that grace? Or do you close the door, satisfied that they got what they deserved? Taylor knew that true change wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about healing the disease. Firing Rebecca had removed a symptom, but the woman who wrote this letter, she was a potential cure. To ignore this would be to waste the entire painful ordeal. She picked up her desk phone and spoke to her assistant. "Give me a contact number for Rebecca Miller, the former Apex flight attendant." A few minutes later, a number was on her screen. Taylor took a deep breath, the kind she took before a high-stakes negotiation, and dialed. A timid, hesitant voice answered on the first ring. "Hello." "Rebecca," Taylor said, her own voice calm and even. "This is Taylor Campbell. I received your letter." There was a sharp intake of breath, then a choked sob from the other end. "Ms. Campbell, I'd like to talk," Taylor cut in, not unkindly. "But not just over the phone. I have a proposition for you. There's a National Diversity in Aviation Summit in New York next month. I've been asked to be the keynote speaker." She paused, letting her next words land with their full, shocking weight. "And I want you to join me on stage." The auditorium for the Diversity in Aviation Summit was packed. Industry executives, journalists, and thought leaders filled every seat, the air buzzing with anticipation. The keynote speaker was the woman who had single-handedly forced their entire industry to look in the mirror, Taylor Campbell. The summit organizers had teased a special guest, and speculation was rampant. When Taylor took the stage to a thunderous, sustained ovation, she looked out at the crowd with the same calm authority she had shown in the Apex boardroom. She began not by recounting her ordeal, but by talking about the future. "We have spent the past few months talking correctly about accountability and systemic reform," she said, her voice resonating through the hall. "But today I want to talk about what comes after. What does real, human change look like?" She paused, letting the question settle. To help answer that, I've asked someone to join me. A woman who was at the very center of the Seat 1A incident. A wave of murmurs and confusion swept through the audience. Cameras that had been resting on tripods were suddenly hoisted onto shoulders. "Please welcome," Taylor said, her voice steady, "Rebecca Miller." The name dropped like a stone in the silent room. Gasps were audible. People turned to each other in disbelief. And then, from the side of the stage, Rebecca walked out. She wasn't in the crisp Apex uniform anymore. She was in a simple gray dress, looking older and incredibly fragile. She clutched a piece of paper in her trembling hands, her eyes fixed on the floor as she walked tentatively toward the second podium. The frantic clicking of cameras was the only sound in the hall. This was not just unexpected. It was a deeply controversial and dangerous move for both women. Rebecca finally looked up, her eyes filled with a raw, painful honesty. "A few months ago," she began, her voice cracking, "I stood on an airplane and I failed. I failed my training, I failed my company, and most profoundly, I failed a fellow human being." She looked directly at Taylor. "I didn't see a passenger with a valid ticket. I saw a profile that didn't fit my own prejudiced expectations. My bias was a wall, and I let it guide my actions." Tears streamed down her face now, but she didn't wipe them away. "I am not here to make excuses. I am here to say that I am deeply, profoundly sorry for the pain that Wall caused Ms. Campbell, and for the damage my actions did to the trust so many people place in airline staff every single day." The hall was tomb silent. Rebecca's confession was so raw, so public, that no one knew how to react. This was Taylor's moment. She walked over from her podium and stood next to the trembling Rebecca. She didn't hug her or offer platitudes. She simply stood beside her, a silent show of solidarity. She then stepped to the mic. "Change begins," Taylor said, her voice full of a powerful grace, when truth is spoken out loud. She placed a steadying hand on Rebecca's shoulder, and the two women stood side by side, facing the stunned audience together. The image was breathtaking. The powerful CEO and the disgraced flight attendant, a living testament to both accountability and the radical possibility of grace. It was a moment of difficult, painful, and beautiful healing, played out for the whole world to see. But as the first hesitant applause began to ripple through the room, a question lingered in the air. Forgiveness is a moment. But what does a legacy look like? What happens a year later when the cameras are gone and the real work of building a new beginning truly starts? 1 year later, the question that had lingered in the air after the summit was, what does a legacy look like? The answer arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet, determined work of building something new. At a press event, a humbled Apex Airlines, led by its CEO Arthur Vance, launched the Apex Foundation for Equity in Aviation, a multi-million-dollar initiative to fund scholarships and mentorship programs for aspiring Black pilots, engineers, and executives. And standing at the podium as the foundation's newly appointed chairperson was Taylor Campbell. She had gone from being the airline's greatest threat to its moral compass, proving her goal was never to destroy, but to rebuild. In the audience that day, looking on with pride, was Malik. The film student who had bravely hit record was now a sharp-dressed summer intern at Novatech Capital. Taylor, impressed by his courage and integrity, had offered him the position, telling him that people who aren't afraid to bear witness are exactly the kind of people who can change the world. His single act of defiance on that flight had altered the course of his entire life, setting him on a path he'd only dreamed of. And Rebecca, after her public apology, found her own quiet path to redemption. With a private letter of recommendation from Taylor, she began working for a nonprofit specializing in restorative justice, using her painful public failure to help teach others about the insidious nature of unconscious bias. The change was visible even to everyday passengers. If you were to board Apex Airlines Flight 212 from New York to Los Angeles today, you would notice a small, elegant plaque next to the seat in the front row. It doesn't celebrate a victory or name an enemy. It simply says, this seat is dedicated to the idea that respect is the journey, not the destination. In honor of the passenger who reminded us all to look closer, Seat 1, it was no longer a throne for the entitled, but a permanent, quiet reminder of the day everything changed. A reminder that dignity is non-negotiable. So much of this story began with one woman being told she didn't belong in one seat. A simple, ugly act of prejudice, of looking at a person and seeing only a profile. They tried to make her invisible, to move her out of sight, to send her to the back of the plane as a matter of operational necessity. They thought they were solving a small problem in first class, but they made a profound miscalculation. They didn't realize who they were talking to. They didn't just ask a passenger to move. They challenged a force of nature. In the end, they learned the lesson that true power isn't about claiming a seat, but about charting a new course for everyone who follows. They tried to move her to the back, but instead, she moved the entire industry forward. This story was only told because one person on that plane refused to be a silent bystander. He saw an injustice, and he hit record. You have that same power in your hands right now. Like this video, to send a message that stories of Black dignity and strength must be seen. Share it, so this voice is heard far beyond the walls of our community. And subscribe to this channel, because every time a story like this is silenced, the injustice wins. Join us in making sure these truths are never ignored again.